Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Green Jobs and Red Tape, Assessing Federal Efforts to Encourage Employment. You'll find in front of you packets containing our witness panel's written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures. I recognize myself now for 5 minutes for an opening statement. The economic crisis of 2008 provided a new administration with the opportunity to expand government's role in a number of different areas. One of the most prominent was the energy sector. This expansion was meant to be timely, targeted, and temporary, quote and unquote. Yet spending is still ongoing today. One of the highlights of the stimulus bill's energy agenda was the goal of creating green jobs that would spur employment, aid the environment, make us most secure, and keep us competitive. With the President's 2012 budget, the President is asking Congress to double down on that strategy. The Startup America campaign, the Clean Energy Initiative, and the Strategy for American Innovation extends and expands many of the same initiatives put forth in the stimulus bill. In the course of reviewing the President's FY12 budget, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee heard from a number of agency officials about the importance of maintaining and expanding these green economy investments. This hearing is the first opportunity to hear perspectives from outside entities. It is important to realize the context that we are assessing these proposals. When the President took office, the average price of gasoline was around $1.84 a gallon. Today, the average price is around $3.79 a gallon. This should come as no surprise. In 2008, before he became the Secretary of Energy, Dr. Stephen Chu stated, quote, "Somehow we have to figure out how to boost the price of gasoline to the levels in Europe," unquote. Gasoline in Europe is roughly $8 a gallon. In a 2008 interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, President Obama, then candidate Obama, stated that, quote, "Under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity rates would necessarily skyrocket," unquote. Necessarily skyrocket. That's what he wants to do. It seems as though this administration's energy and green jobs agenda are both built less upon stimulating our economy and creating domestic jobs and more on picking winners and losing and financing foreign investment in production. On one hand, the administration is limiting development of oil production in the outer continental shelf. On the other hand, it is promoting the development of oil off the coast of Brazil. On a recent trip to Brazil, President Obama stated, Americans, quote, "want to help with technology and support to develop these oil reserves safely. And when you're ready to start selling, we want to be one of your best customers." On one hand, the President advocates for federal investments in green technologies as an economic stimulus and jobs creator. On the other hand, U.S. taxpayer dollars are purchasing renewable energy equipment manufactured in Europe and in Asia. A 2010 report by the Investigative Reporting Workshop found that more than $1.6 billion in stimulus funds were used to buy foreign manufactured products. If the goal is to create jobs here in America, I'm not sure that this is the right method. It seems to me that the left hand does not know what the far left hand is doing. There are a number of important policies that will ensure economic prosperity here in the United States. A competitive tax policy that maintains and entices corporate activity, a legal system that respects contracts and patents, thereby rewarding innovation, a stable regulatory environment that both protects public health and safety and encourages economic activity, and a highly educated and trained workforce capable of meeting 21st century challenges are all imperative to prosperity. Unfortunately, we find ourselves with the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. An administration that stated It seeks to, quote, share all intellectual property as much as possible, unquote, and an ever-expanding regulatory system strangling small businesses and killing jobs. Today we'll hear from outside experts on what role government incentives, such as loan guarantees, subsidies, tax incentives, mandates, R&D, and regulations can or should play in augmenting these principles. Now the Chair recognizes my ranking member, Ms. Edwards, for an opening statement. Ms. Edwards, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses today. Interesting hearing that we have. The idea that government cannot make public investment choices that benefit the country actually flies in the face of our nation's actual history. Canals, railways, roads, ports, highways, airports, the electrical grid, and the Internet are all product of government activities. The government has used different tools at different times to encourage these investments, but all of it was accomplished through government initiative. Building our current infrastructure created jobs and established the base for a national economy that's been among the most creative and productive in the world. As we see new competitors rise around the world and as we face new environmental challenges and energy supply issues, we need to make sure we step up and prove that we are just as innovative and dynamic as the Americans who came before us. The collapse of the housing market bubble in 2008 brought the country to the edge of an economic disaster with high unemployment and drying up of capital for businesses to meet their day-to-day expenses, much less look for opportunities to expand. And while we like to think that normal economic times find consumer demand the bedrock of our economic prosperity, in the months after September 2008, the times were hardly normal. Consumers reeled from collapsing value in their homes and investments. High unemployment left even those with a job feeling deeply insecure about their financial future. And when faced with these real conditions, it would be foolish to think that consumer demand alone was going to pull the economy out of the nosedive of what could have been a full-blown depression. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the Recovery Act, was adopted by Congress and signed into law by President Obama with the twin goals of getting America back to work and funding projects that would create a more modern, robust infrastructure, 21st century infrastructure, to support economic growth for future generations. The fact that the infrastructure could also reduce our dependence on imported oil and help reduce our carbon emissions, producing a cleaner environment and fighting global climate change, was actually an added social benefit. And despite the investments of the Recovery Act, much still remains to be done. We're no longer officially out of the recession. We are officially out of the recession, but we need to create almost 14 million jobs in order to get Americans back to work. I believe that we have to make sustained commitment to public investment in our infrastructure, in our research, enterprise, and in supporting innovation. I don't believe that government is incapable of choosing wisely about public investments. And I do not believe that the government has no effective role in the face of high unemployment. Congress can't just sit on its hands while people are losing their jobs, their security, their homes, and their future. The government has many tools at its disposal to help. I'm particularly interested in seeing the research and development tax credit made permanent and to increasing the domestic production activities deduction for property manufactured in the United States, which was the result of research and development done here. In fact, I've introduced, along with my colleague from Maryland and colleague on the full committee, Roscoe Bartlett, H.R. 689, a 21st Century Reinvestment Act that would do just that. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation issued a report in 2006 that found that the U.S. had gone from offering the most generous research and development tax credit that we had dropped to number 17 by 2004. An effective way to get people back to productive work and to reward innovation is to reward companies that innovate and create jobs here in America domestically. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses as we explore these issues today, sort of less investigation and oversight and much more in exploration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Dr. Kenneth Green is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. David Kreutzer, is that correct? Kreutzer, is that correct? Kreutzer. Okay. I can't spell and I can't pronounce my name. It's Broun, spelled with a U, but anyway, Doctor, I apologize. Dr. Kreutzer is the Research Fellow in Energy, Economics, and Climate Change at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Josh Bivens is an economist with the Economic Policy Institute. Dr. David Montgomery is a Senior Vice President at NERA Economic Consulting. And Mr. William Kovacs is the Senior Vice President for Environment, Technology, and Regulatory Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I welcome all of y'all here today and appreciate y'all coming and participating. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each. So please, we're facing some votes very shortly, so if we want to try to get through this and not be here all afternoon, if y'all would try to limit your spoken testimony to 5 minutes or less, your full written testimony will be put in the record. And then each committee member will have 5 minutes to ask questions. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight to receive testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objections to taking an oath? Dr. Montgomery, I don't see. Okay. Let the record reflect that all witnesses willing to take an oath by shaking their head that they had no objections to doing so. Y'all also may be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel with you here today? Okay, let the record reflect that all witnesses indicated they have no counsel. Now, if all of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to affirm and tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much, gentlemen. Let the record reflect that all the witnesses participating have taken the oath. Now I recognize our first witness, Dr. Kenneth Green of the American Enterprise Institute. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Dr. Green.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Edwards, members of the Subcommittee, for having me here today. At the end of my testimony, I have appended a pertinent study that I recently completed for AEI titled The Myth of Green Energy Jobs, the European Experience. Much of my testimony is derived from that paper. My testimony represents my personal views only and should not be construed as the official position of AEI or any other person or organization. The question of green job creation is simply a variant on the general question of whether or not government creates jobs by intervening in the marketplace. The question has been debated since at least the 1850s, when Frédéric Bastiat, a French journalist and politician, wrote "What is Seen and What is Not Seen," an essay that should be mandatory reading for anyone interested in public policy. Bastiat framed the idea of government job creation in the broken windows fallacy. As he explained, imagine some shopkeepers have their windows broken by a boy throwing rocks. At first, everyone is horrified, and they blame the boy. But then someone points out that, well, it's not really all that bad, because now jobs have been created for the window makers, the glass blowers, glaziers. And so, really, there was no loss, because you have new jobs in making windows. But of course, did the child do a public good by breaking the window, the baker's window, and making a job for the glazier? And the answer is no, because beforehand, the baker would have used his money perhaps to expand his bakery, put on a coffee shop, hire a new baker, and instead he used the money to replace a perfectly good window. So the village as a whole has lost the value of the window and has not gained any new jobs as a result. So let's look at, the analogy holds just as well when the government breaks jobs in one sector, breaks windows in one sector of the economy, and uses the money it takes from there to create jobs elsewhere. When they pick product A over product B, what is seen is the new sales of product A. What is not seen are the lost sales of product B and the associated job losses. So to look at our possible green future, let's look at what happened in Europe recently, where they've been very aggressive in pushing for green energy on the premise that it will create green jobs, green technologies, and a green economy. And I'll start with Spain. In March of 2009, researchers at the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos released a study examining what happened in Spain as a result of their push into green energy. The study calculates that from 2000 to 2009, it cost them $815,000 each to create a green job, rising to $1.5 million to create a green job in the wind industry. And they calculate that for every job created in the green energy industry, 2.2 jobs were destroyed elsewhere in the general economy. Now to Italy, where a study performed by the Bruno Leone Institute found even worse experience. They found that because green jobs were so expensive to create in Italy, for every green job created in the green energy sector, 5 to 7 jobs could have been created in the general economy with the same amount of money. They also found the majority of these green jobs were temporary. Following through on existing plans, they calculated for 2020 would create quite a few jobs, up to 112,000, but 60% of them would be temporary. Now the United Kingdom. A recent report by the consultancy Verso Economics found that for every job created in the United Kingdom in renewable energy, 3.7 jobs were lost in the general economy. And what's interesting about that particular study is it uses a methodology that the Scottish government itself uses to calculate job losses as a result of taxation. It uses a model that the other studies I mentioned were criticized for not using, and yet it comes up with the same result as the other two studies. Before I conclude, I was asked to comment a bit about the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 and its effectiveness in creating green jobs. A news article in 2010, September, pointed out that only $20 billion of the $92 billion allocated for renewable energy projects had been spent. And according to the Department of Energy, as was mentioned earlier, much of that was spent abroad creating green jobs in China, Spain, and South Korea. For example, a report by the American University found that 11 U.S. wind farms used their stimulus grants to buy wind turbines made abroad. 695 out of about 1,000 wind turbines purchased with stimulus grants were made elsewhere. The Department of Energy reports that for some green stimulus projects, 80% of the spending was abroad. So, given what most of the stimulus is unspent, and much of what was spent elsewhere, it is hard to see how it had a significant impact on creating green jobs here in the United States. And don't take only my word for it. April 11th, 2011, the EPA put out an at-a-glance form, and this report says that they are unable to determine what the results were of their stimulus spending, whether it created any jobs at all, because while they could track having spent the money, they could not figure out what was done with it. So it's unlikely that we have seen an explosion of green jobs. In conclusion, the idea that government can create jobs on net in the economy is a myth. Painting the myth green doesn't make it any less of a myth. The experience of Europe, which has preceded us in the quest for a new economy, is uniformly negative and is proving unsustainable, with subsidies being cut back and feed-in tariffs reduced. And not to discount Americans' exceptionalism and ingenuity, there's absolutely no reason to believe that things would happen differently here. Green energy requires significant subsidization. By definition, that means that jobs in the wind and solar industry will be more expensive to create than those in the general economy, and that means less jobs on net. I thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Green. Now I recognize our next witness, Dr. David Kreutzer. Kreutzer, is it?
I'll read my statement here. It says,
okay.
My name is David Kreutzer.
Kreutzer.
Kreutzer. And I have to confess that I had to call your receptionist to figure out how to pronounce your name. I hope I get it right.
You're recognized for 5 minutes, Doctor.
Okay, thank you. I am Research Fellow in Energy Economics and Climate Change at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own. It should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Chairman Broun, Ranking Member Edwards, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for giving me this opportunity to discuss the employment impacts of federal energy and climate policies. I would like to make two fundamental points today. The first is that government regulation is costly. The second is that government spending is costly. Both of these statements are true whether the economy is at full employment or in a recession. Now, let me also say that government spending and regulation can have benefits, but we need to compare those benefits to the costs instead of pretending that there are no costs. Too often, proponents of spending and regulation focus on the jobs and income going to those who receive the government money or who provide the necessary goods and services for compliance with the regulations. They ignore the losses to the other parts of the economy that are needed to finance these jobs. A report by the Blue-Green Alliance and the Economic Policy Institute sets out an analogy to try to explain why an apparently ineffective stimulus program was actually effective but undersized. Though probably not the intent of the authors, and I believe in a few minutes we'll hear about that, the analogy captures the flawed logic of virtually every green job study I've seen. Here's the quote from that report. A good metaphor for this controversy is the temperature in a log cabin on a cold winter's night. Say the weather is forecast for the temperature to reach 30 degrees. To stay warm, you decide to burn 3 logs in a fireplace. You do the math and chemistry and calculate that burning these 3 logs will generate enough heat to bring the inside of the cabin to 50 degrees, or 20 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. But the forecast is wrong, and instead temperatures plummet to 10 degrees, and burning the logs only results in a cabin temperature of 30 degrees. Has log burning failed as a strategy to generate heat? The flaw in this analogy is that there isn't any woodshed. The only available logs come from the walls of the cabin. it would be no surprise that burning more of the wall does not make the cabin warmer. Likewise, there is no money shed from which the government can finance all the green subsidies and programs. These resources are extracted from other parts of the economy. They do not and cannot come from outside of the economy. Yes, when firms receive government subsidies, there may be additional jobs at those firms, just as it may get warmer right by the fireplace when more logs are torn from the wall and burned. But just as the overall cabin temperature will plummet, the overall economy suffers as resources are taken from better uses and put to less valued ones. There is no money shed to finance the cost of complying with a cap-and-trade regime such as Waxman-Markey. Indeed, Heritage Analysis estimated that such legislation would reduce national income as measured by gross domestic product by nearly $9 trillion over the first 25 years of the program and cause employment losses of nearly 2.5 million jobs. There is no money shed to pay compliance costs of EPA regulations. There is no money shed to subsidize loan guarantees. Let me just use one example of the examples from my written testimony, the case of Solyndra. In the fall of 2009, Solyndra, a solar panel manufacturer, received a loan guarantee of $535 million. That's in the fall of 2009. In the spring of 2010, half a year later or less, Solyndra failed to successfully complete its initial public offering because an independent audit questioned the viability of the company, as people weren't going to buy the stocks. In the fall of 2010, Solyndra actually closed one of its manufacturing facilities that had been in operation when they got the loan. There's no money shed to finance green stimulus programs. Even in a time of recession with underutilized resources, there are costs to government expenditure, whether it is purchasing military jets, building highways, or subsidizing green energy projects. But even if government spending can stimulate the economy, and that doesn't mean there are no costs, but if the government can stimulate the economy, the spending needs to be correctly timed, and the targets should be those with the best return for the money. Spending that raises electricity rates does not fit this bill. Figure 6 from the Blue-Green Alliance Economic Policy Institute report, reproduced in my written testimony, purports to show that GDP, consumption, and employment all improved after the enactment of the ARRA stimulus bill. However, using the measures offered in the chart, okay, rates of change at an annualized rate, it clearly shows that all three measures of economic activity were turning the corner months before any stimulus spending started. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kreutzer. Is that better? Thank you, Dr. Kreutzer. Our next witness is Dr. Josh Bivens with Economic Policy Institute. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Doctor.
I'd like to thank the chairman and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Josh Bivens. I'm an economist at the Economic Policy Institute. Today's testimonies reflect only my own views. I just make a couple of relatively quick points about the efficacy of what we're broadly going to call green investments. I mean, essentially they have two benefits. One is in the short run, we have a pressing problem of very high unemployment rates. And the reason why we have those high unemployment rates is because there's a shortfall in demand for goods and services in the economy. Green investments will help plug that shortfall, bring down the unemployment rate in the short run. In the longer run, the reasons why you undertake green investments is because it is recognized that we need to transition to a cleaner energy economy for many reasons. One, just for the health of citizens of the United States. Coal-fired power plants are very bad for that health. And also to deal with the effects of climate change. Let me take these in order. Obviously, the most pressing problem facing the U.S. economy over the short time horizon is high rates of unemployment. And we know why unemployment is high today. There's a shortfall of demand in the economy because an $8 trillion bubble in home prices destroyed household balance sheets, made households cut back on spending, destroyed the residential construction industry, cascaded throughout the economy, had businesses cutting back their capital spending because customers stopped coming through the door. Essentially, it's clear why unemployment is high today. There is a shortfall of demand in the U.S. economy. The shock to private sector demand stemming from the bursting housing bubble is actually larger than the shock that led to the Great Depression. A key reason why we didn't have a second depression is that we allowed fiscal support, debt-financed increases in spending, and decreases in taxes to act as a shock absorber. Until the economy reaches pre-recession unemployment rates, further fiscal support would provide similarly welcome downward pressure on the unemployment rate. For the simple purpose of propping up demand in an economy hit by a negative spending shock, most kinds of spending and transfer payments are going to be as good as the others. But the architects of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act sensibly decided to make sure that many of these investments would reap long-term gains as well. And so they essentially were dedicated to providing a down payment on making the needed transition to a clean energy economy. The effects of RA have become controversial among policymakers, and that's really odd because these effects are not controversial at all among professional economic forecasters. People in the private sector and the public sector whose salary depends on knowing what's going to happen in the economy over the next couple of years are unanimous that the Recovery Act boosted GDP, jobs, and reduced the unemployment rate. The argument against the effectiveness of RA is kind of through simple fiat. It didn't work because we know it cannot work. Essentially says that any money borrowed by the government to finance stimulus takes money out of the hands of households and businesses who will spend less. You know, this is just wrong. The recession happened because households and businesses were saving too much to generate enough demand to keep unemployment low. If the government didn't do anything, that would be the end of the story. We'd be stuck in a high unemployment economy for quite some time. If the government instead decided to accommodate the savings that households and businesses were already doing, the savings was already there. If they just accommodated the savings by swapping money for treasury bonds and then spending the money on public sector investments to generate demand, then you would put more people to work, and that is exactly what has happened. Essentially, opponents of stimulus want to argue that public spending chases away private spending by competing with it for scarce resources. But scarce resources are not the problem in the U.S. economy right now. It's labor, not scarce. There's 4.5 unemployed workers for every job in the economy. Corporations are sitting on record amounts of cash ready to finance investment. The problem is not scarce resources. The problem is demand, and green investments help solve that problem. In the longer term, say longer than 5 years, assuming once again we get to some tolerable unemployment rate, the primary benefit of green investments isn't in boosting the net number of jobs in the U.S. economy. Rather, the benefits are in making the U.S. economy more productive and better poised to meet the demand of transitioning to a cleaner energy economy in the future. In my written testimony, I go over the evidence that says a larger stock of public capital, public investments would do much to boost U.S. productivity. I won't rehash that here. Last, I just want to sort of address the argument that green investment is just picking winners that the private sector is somehow by definition better at doing. Yeah, I don't think that's right. I mean, one, policy failures have so far not given the private sector the right price signals to incentivize green investment. You know, greenhouse gas emissions are free for individual emitters, but they're very costly for other stakeholders in the economy. Until this externality is priced, you know, the best way to price it would be through market-based programs like cap and trade. I know that's not going to happen soon. There's going to be stunted incentive for the private sector to undertake the optimal amount of green investment. So the government has to step in and do some of it. And further, many of these green investments are for public goods, goods that are less rival, less excludable than private goods, and or have features of natural monopolies. This is the textbook example of goods that should be provided by the government, not the private sector. So the idea that we are chasing away from the private sector from providing these goods and services, I think is pretty clearly wrong. So I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Bivens. Our next witness is Dr. David Montgomery with NERA Economic Counseling. I recognize you for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Brown and Ranking Member Edwards. I'm honored again by your invitation to appear before the subcommittee. I've recently joined NERA Economic Consulting as a Senior Vice President, but today I'm testifying entirely on my own behalf. These are my own independent opinions and conclusions, do not necessarily represent the positions of my employer or any of its clients. I have 2 primary recommendations. First, stop using green technology as an engine of macroeconomic policy. That approach takes resources away from R&D that could lead to fundamental technology advances. It increases the costs of meeting environmental goals, and it's inferior macroeconomic policy as well. Second, take some of the resources now being spent unnecessarily on demonstration and deployment and put them to work cushioning real research from the onset of the inevitable and necessary era of fiscal austerity. It would also be helpful to create new institutional arrangements to assure continuity of energy R&D funding and prevent that funding from being starved in the future by the huge budgetary demands of large-scale demonstrations of unready or excessively costly technologies. As you consider reductions in spending, it's critically important to preserve the current levels of funding for basic and applied energy research. All the rest of the direct funding, subsidies, loan guarantees, and standards to promote large-scale technology demonstration and deployment need to be examined critically, because most can go without sacrificing either environmental goals and at a great saving to the taxpayer. So why are reductions in basic research so harmful? It's not possible to get the best science and technological advances with stop-go-stop funding. Good researchers will not tolerate being torqued around. They'll go back to fields of research where that does not happen, and the flow of discoveries required for breakthrough applications will stop. And why can reducing direct support for green energy be so beneficial? That support is a solution in search of a problem. Cost-effective environmental programs apply directly to the emissions that cause harm. That's what we environmental economists have been trying to teach our students, at least for the 30 years I've been in the game. Tilting the playing field to favor specific technologies only forces American industry to adopt more costly ways of meeting the requirements of environmental laws and regulations. There's already every incentive for industry to choose the most cost-effective means to meet those requirements, and I cannot understand how we now think that energy is a public good, since it has been provided cost-effectively by the private sector for centuries. The only virtue green technologies can claim is superior performance in identifiable environmental dimensions. So environmental programs, not technology subsidies and mandates, should guide their adoption. In some specific cases, particular kinds of support for technology demonstration might be justified. But history and economics make it clear that these are the exceptions, and allowing the exceptions also opens the door to a flood of rent-seeking pleas for support and earmarks. Government funding for basic and applied research is still needed to provide the flow of discoveries on which cleaner and cheaper technologies will be based. Unfortunately, every prior Congress that's been faced with the choice has sacrificed the unquestioned long-term benefits of R&D to maintain jobs through fundamentally unnecessary and wasteful subsidies for existing technologies. I urge you to change that dismal record. I haven't used up much of my time. I'd be happy in the future to debate some points of macroeconomic policy, but I wanted to focus on R&D. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Montgomery. Just for the information of members of the committee, we have a vote on, and for the witnesses, we have a vote on now. We will be able to hear Mr. Kovacs' testimony. After Mr. Kovacs' testimony, we will recess and reconvene 10 minutes after the last of 4 votes begins. So if you would, please come right back after you vote, and we'll get back as quickly as we can. I apologize for the interruption, but unfortunately we've got the votes. So now I want to recognize our final witness, Mr. William Kovacs, of the U.S. Chamber. Mr. Kovacs, you've got 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Edwards, and the members of the committee. You've asked me to address 2 issues. One, the impediments to the development of private sector energy projects, including the creation of green energy jobs, and to identify underutilized federal programs that could spur job growth without new statutory authority. There are actions Congress could take, and they could take them now without any appropriated funds, that would create tens of thousands of clean energy and energy efficiency jobs, generate billions of dollars in additional GDP, expand the development of clean energy technology, and substantially reduce the energy use of the world's largest energy user, the federal government. You can do this by doing 2 simple things without any federal funding. One is you need to streamline the permitting process for private sector energy projects, and 2, we need to maximize the implementation of the energy savings performance contracts that Congress passed in 2007. Let me expand on both of these. If you look at page 4 in my testimony, it's a map of what we call our Project No Project, and that's an identification of projects in 2000, March of 2010, that were stopped by permitting challenges across the United States. And what's so fascinating about this is that the only common thread is that they were stopped by sequential challenges. They would start with one law, move to another law, move to another law, and because the statute of limitations is generally 6 years, you could be the last person in your law school class and hold it up for 10 years. It's not a trick. But what's so important is that in this process, when we did the economic study, if these projects had all moved forward during the 7-year period of time, which would have been the construction, they would have generated about $1.1 trillion in new GDP, and they would have created about 1.9 million jobs a year. And then for the 20 or 30 years that they were in existence, they would have produced more jobs. We recognized within the study that you couldn't build them all at once. There wasn't the people, there weren't the materials. So we did a sensitivity analysis, and even if you took whatever was happening in, let's say we did the largest project in each state, you still had $500 billion in GDP and hundreds of thousands of jobs. And we did that for nuclear or all the renewables, pick your choice. But some of the projects, if a large group would have gone forward, you still would have created the jobs. The solution there is permit streamlining. Congress has handled this issue many times. You handled it in the highway bill in 2005. You literally created the time to get through the process for NEPA in half, from about 72 months to 38 months. You did it in the stimulus project with requiring the use of NEPA in as expeditiously a manner as possible. That allowed 180,000 out of 250,000 projects to get into the marketplace quickly. The second point that I want to talk about is energy savings performance contracts. In a climate of fiscal restraint, you literally have an $80 billion pool of contracts that you can move immediately. An energy savings performance contract is a statutorily established private sector partnership in which the private sector energy service company installs in federal buildings all of the energy efficient equipment at its own expense and is paid from the energy savings over a 20 to 25 year period of time. You're probably all familiar with it. This building's subject to one of the energy savings performance contracts, as well as the other house buildings. The energy service company guarantees the proposed energy savings and takes full responsibility for any of the shortfalls. So there's absolutely no risk to the federal government. It's an $80 billion authorization that can be triggered literally by the federal government wanting to do this. One of the things that we have that's been very clear is that there have been two problems with this issue. One is because it's outside of what we would call just using appropriations, the federal contractors in the Department of Energy that manage these programs really are not familiar with it, and they could use more training, and that's based on basically GAO reports. And the second is, I think the stimulus, from what we can tell from both the GAO reports and the obligated funds under the stimulus, because appropriated funds were available, it was easier for the Department of Energy to move and use the appropriated funds first rather than the energy savings performance contract. So what happens is you ended up in the last year with only 6 projects totaling $104 million when you have an $80 billion authorization. Oak Ridge National Labs indicated that this would create 40 billion jobs, $21 billion in saved energy, and take 10 million cars off the road. In my last 10 seconds, recommended solutions, an executive order, get the president behind us. This is an excellent law, and if he makes it, if he requires this to be used first before appropriated funds, that would move it along. You need training, and then finally congressional oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kovacs. I appreciate all the witnesses staying pretty much within your 5 minutes, and Dr. Montgomery, for you're being even under time. If I remember last time you were here, you were under time also, and I appreciate that very much. Unfortunately, we've got about 6 minutes or 6.5 minutes on this vote. Y'all can stand, the witnesses can stand at ease. The committee will recess until 10 minutes after the last vote begins. Call to order the continuation of this hearing, and I thank our witnesses for your forbearance and our going to vote. And we try to rush back here to minimize y'all's time. So I thank y'all for your testimony, and I want to remind members that the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. And the chair at this point will open the round of questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Federal efforts to create green jobs cost money. Our nation is currently very heavily in debt and running a huge deficit that's unsustainable. Where are we getting the money to fund these projects, and what impact does that have on the overall economy? I'd like anyone who's, Dr. Green's nodding his head, so I'll give you first go with that.
Other than printing up money, the government doesn't have any money. And therefore, when it gives money to subsidize an industry or to create jobs in a certain sector or to subsidize battery production or so forth, it takes that money from another part of the productive economy. Unless you subscribe to the mattress theory of capital, which is that people actually stick their capital under a mattress and don't have it working somewhere in the economy, either in their bank or in their savings account or in investments. It's simply the truth that the government scoops money out of the economy here, and they hand it over here. They take their cut along the way, and the jobs they create are more expensive than would be created in the market, and you have less jobs on net.
Dr. Kreutzer.
I would say even if people did put their money in the mattress, you have to follow the real resources, all right? And if you are somehow going to build the new high-tech economy entirely with people from the unemployment line, you know, then that's where the cost will be low. But that isn't what happens. I mean, you use resources that have an opportunity cost.
I think
Mr. Kovacs, I saw that you were nodding. Did you want to?
Oh, I'm happy to take a crack at it.
Dr. Bivens?
I mean, the short answer is they're borrowing it, and now's a perfect time to borrow it because U.S. households and businesses are saving at historic rates because they're terrified because of the recession. They've lost a lot of wealth, and they're taking that savings that otherwise would not go to productive use, and they're making sure there's enough demand in the economy to fill the hole caused by the bursting of the housing bubble.
Mr. Kovacs? Or do you, Dr. Montgomery? We'll just go right down the line. Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you. I think that the notion of real resources really is the important one, that that's what most of the green job studies miss, that you have to ask where the money is where the funding is coming from. And that means what the real resources are, what's the capital and labor that is building green technology, what would it be doing otherwise? And if the government has to provide subsidies to get that capital and labor into green technologies, that means it costs more than what the alternative would have been. So, yes, that's the sense in which there's a cost. But I think in terms of fiscal stimulus, there really is an error in thinking that we can justify spending on green jobs as a short-term stimulus, because it's probably the worst way to spend short-term money. What we need to do for every fiscal economist agrees, I think, that in the recession what you want to do is you want to get money into people's hands as fast as possible. You want to ramp that spending up rapidly, and then you want to ramp it down just as rapidly when you're coming out of the recession. What you want to do for R&D and technology development is provide a long-term stable set of incentives, as I was describing before. That's exactly the opposite of the program. That's the last program you would want to try to ramp up and ramp down to do something about the recession, even if you believe that fiscal policy is going to work.
Mr. Kovacs.
Well, I certainly don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do want to push the energy savings performance contracts. In some way, shape, or form, they've been around since 1985. They're a bipartisan effort. All the money is put forth through the private sector. The government is guaranteed that they will not pay any more than their energy costs. They theoretically will save about $21 billion, depending on how the contract, depending on how long the equipment lasts beyond the contract period. They take, what's the equivalent of 10 million cars off the road, but more than anything, the government's guaranteed that it will not pay more and it creates jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Kovacs. I have 3/4 of a minute left, so I'll ask Dr. Kreutzer. I think you brought up Evergreen Solar. They received $20 million in funds to build a plant in Bivens, Massachusetts. Shortly after receiving those funds, Evergreen Solar shuttered the plant, fired 800 workers, is now moving its operations to China. What prevents, was it you, Dr. Kreutzer? Oh, Dr. Green, okay. Dr. Green, then, what prevents other companies from doing the same?
Absolutely nothing. And in fact, all the incentives point in the opposite direction. China has temporarily at least cornered the market on the rare earth elements which are used to make advanced technologies, including cell phones, wind turbines, solar panels, and the like. And they are instituting cuts in exports of those materials. And so if you want to produce and have access to these materials and lower labor rates and lower environmental standards for production, and these are quite damaging technologies to produce, you want to go build them in China. So the incentive is to actually take the stimulus, take government money here, do your R&D here, and then take what you've learned off to the low-cost production of China.
Thank you, Dr. Green. My time's up. Now I recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I just have one quick question, and you can just answer yes or no, and then we'll get to the meat of it. I'm curious as to whether you or your organization, the organizations that you represent, supported the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the stimulus package.
AEI, as an institution, does not take official positions. Some of our scholars did, and some of the scholars didn't, I believe.
Did you?
No, I did not.
Thank you.
That's not my area to do energy, and I'm not speaking for Heritage, but I don't believe they supported it.
Thank you. Dr. Bivens?
Our institute did support it.
Thank you. Dr. Montgomery?
No, consulting firms clearly don't support legislation one
Did
way
you?
or the other. Did
Did
I?
you?
I feel that my job is to try to explain when I'm asked what the likely consequences of decisions are, and
So you don't have a
Also,
position on the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act?
I'd be happy to, as I am today, discussing what I think its effects were. I don't know whether you mean that's a position or not, but these are certainly my professional opinions about what the effects of the act.
But you didn't have a
would be.
position at the time whether you supported or opposed the Recovery Act?
What do you mean by a position?
Did you support or oppose the Recovery Act? Did you
In what context?
Did you
Cocktail
support
party conversation?
Let me finish my question, please. Did you support the president's signing into law and the passage out of this Congress of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act?
Well, I'm not a member of Congress, so I didn't get to vote on it one way or the other.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kovacs?
The chamber supported it.
Thank you. I'm just curious, when it was passed, it was, I think it was because of a collapse in consumer demand and a financial system that really was on the brink of disaster and job losses. And so I am curious as to each of you if there's a situation that doesn't justify the government stepping in to create jobs and restore confidence in the economy, such as the time that we experienced from 2008 and beyond, what would it be? Dr. Green?
Since I am not an economist, macro, micro, or otherwise, it's personal opinion. There were different ways. Was it legitimate for the government to step in? Probably so. I'm actually not anti-government. I think government is vitally important. It's like fire. It's a necessary thing. It's great in the fireplace. It's wonderful on the stove. It's not so good on the carpets and on the drapes. But there are different ways I think it could have been implemented that I would have preferred, which is why I didn't support it.
Thank you. Dr. Bivens, is there an appropriate time when the government should intervene in cases of high unemployment and collapse of confidence in the market?
Absolutely. I mean, in specific, over the past couple of years, why it was so appropriate for the American Recovery Act to be passed was because our primary tool for fighting recessions, Federal Reserve policy, had already pretty much maxed out its conventional ammunition. There was very much little extra the Fed could do. Something else had to come in and try to support the economy. That's what made it so appropriate in this context.
And so you come to a conclusion in your testimony that jobs were created, the economy was stabilized. How do you know that? From an economic perspective and from an evaluation perspective, how do you know that?
I referenced the sort of consensus among forecasters, and that's not evidence in and of itself, but what it reflects is that there is a lot of strong evidence underlying it. One is just the timing of the act. It works very well with when the downward spiral was arrested. Two, you do economic simulations where you try to construct, and this is what the Council for Economic Advisors did when they did their quarterly reports on the Recovery Act. And you can get a baseline path of how the economy would have done given the trajectory of economic variables as the crisis hit, and then see how it actually did do relative to that counterfactual baseline. And then three, you use the multipliers that have gotten such a bad name in this debate, a given amount of spending on food stamps or public sector investment. People act like these multipliers come from thin air. They don't come from thin air. They come from lots and lots of empirical research at the effect of government spending in environments like we saw in 2008. That is, when the interest rate is at its zero or lower bound, rebound when you've got the threat of deflation. In those environments, past government spending has provided very large multipliers. That's where those come from. So that's where I get those.
Thank you. And then lastly, Mr. Kovacs, can you imagine an environment today in which we wouldn't have done passed the Recovery Act and what that would mean to the businesses that you represent?
Well, actually, I think we, as the Chamber put it, an enormous amount of constructive thought into trying to work with Congress. One of the provisions that we had been lobbying for was what Senators Barrasso and Boxer put in, which was the way that you have to treat NEPA. In other words, it has to be handled in the most expeditious way possible. And we had no idea how many projects were really going to be impacted, but we knew there weren't that many shovel-ready projects. In the end, according to the administration, that provision was used over 180,000 times. So we think that we added to really making the act work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I guess, Mr. Miller, you recognized for 5 minutes. I was just looking around to see who was here. So you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Trying to find someone recognized besides me.
No, I was Brad Miller. Congressman Miller. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you. Dr. Green, you just a moment ago said that you're not an economist, macro and micro. Actually, my information is that your PhD is in environmental science and engineering. You have a BS in biology and a master's in molecular genetics. Did you take macro and micro in college?
Yes, sir. Yes, Congressman. As part of my doctoral degree at UCLA, the program I was in was an interdisciplinary and policy-oriented doctoral program in which we had a core course on decision-making theory that included economics. Furthermore, I have worked at and with economists now for 16 years, including for 3 years editing a journal of a think tank that was primarily economic studies. So I'm not an economist, but that does not mean I'm not versed in economics.
Okay, but you don't have an academic credential that you would not be qualified to peer review for a peer-reviewed economics journal, would you?
I believe I have, but I'll leave that to your judgment.
Okay, but all of your testimony today is on economics, correct?
Essentially, yes.
Okay, well, in the 3 studies that you refer to are all economic studies, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if those studies were peer-reviewed?
I'm not aware of whether they were peer-reviewed or not. But then again, I don't hold that peer review is a particular guarantor of accuracy, and that has been clearly documented in the university.
Okay. Do you know if those studies have been criticized by other economists as methodologically unsound?
Well, yes, naturally. I mean, all studies in this area are criticized, including...
Well, isn't that one of the reasons for peer reviews, is to have a discussion back and forth between those who are familiar with methodology about whether the studies are methodologically sound?
Sure, and my guess is they actually did consult with their peers to have their research findings checked.
Okay.
However, even peer-reviewed studies are the source of debate. Look at the IPCC reports. Look at all of the studies that underlie it.
Do you know the extent to which, do you know if they got any funding from the fossil fuel industries?
I have no idea what their sources of funding are.
You don't know that they did?
I don't know what their sources of funding are at all.
Okay. You are a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. You say that you're here expressing your own opinion. I assume you're not on unpaid leave today. And in fact, if we look at the website for AEI in a few days, they will probably tout your testimony today as a credential for you. Tell us what support AEI gets from the fossil fuel industry.
Well, first to correct the record, I'm a resident scholar at AEI.
Okay.
It's an arbitrary distinction or distinction that only matters inside, but for the record, that's the case. I have no idea, to tell you the truth, what the fossil fuel industry donates to AEI. The scholars are walled off from the fundraising process entirely, and I couldn't begin to tell you,
okay.
Or any other donor to AEI.
All right. Dr. Bivens, are you familiar with the 3 studies that Dr. Green wrote about?
I'm familiar with 2 of the 3, the Spanish and Italian. I have not read the Scottish one.
Okay, you presumably are qualified to peer review them as an economist. What is your peer review?
I think they're pretty bad. I mean, essentially, they compare the labor intensity of jobs supported by green investments versus some economy-wide average. and because the labor intensity is lower, they decide that money could be more profitably spent somewhere else in the economy. I mean, that's ridiculous. If you just look at jobs in the utility sector in the United States today, they are not labor intensive at all. It's not a real shock. You know, these are very capital intensive industries. So the idea that you could somehow just stop spending on utilities in the U.S. economy today and devote the money to other activities and create more jobs, that the utility sector is killing jobs, that's an insane way to think of the issue. So basically, they have come up with the blockbuster finding that utilities are not very labor intensive, which was not a surprise to anyone.
Okay. A lot of the testimony today has been that government support distorts the market. And I see some heads nodding. Yes, that's correct. That's what your testimony is. That, you know, presumably if government is supporting something in one way, presumably alternative energy is in competition with coal, with oil and gas, with nuclear, and by supporting alternative energies, it distorts what the market would otherwise do. Since 1948, there has been $91 billion in funding for nuclear energy. Excuse me, there's been a total of, that's correct, $91 billion for nuclear energy, $46 billion for fossil energy, and 11% or $21 billion for alternative energy. That's wind and solar and everything else together. Has that distorted the marketplace at all? Mr. Green, Dr. Green?
I'd like to say, first of all, one has to keep these things in perspective. When you look at subsidies per megawatt hour, you do not see a dominance in the oil and petrochemical sector. I've testified before. I believe all subsidies distort markets, and all subsidies in the energy field, energy markets, should be removed to everyone. Fossil fuels, nuclear power, wind, solar, alternative battery technology. It doesn't really matter.
Mr. Kovacs, do you have an opinion on this?
I mean, look, we have, you know, we've generally supported the advancement of technology at various stages. We've, for years, have supported the advancement and the funding of all the technologies in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, 2007. We believe that one of the ways to begin addressing some of the issues that we have in this country is through technology, and obviously funding is a part of it. You know, so to that extent, we have supported it, and I think in the end, one of the things we're here today to talk about is to say, okay, it seems as though the climate has changed. We've borrowed a lot of money as a nation, and we're here to try to give ideas as to how we might cooperate and do both energy efficiency, promote technology, and have it done through the private sector. So, but yes, we've always supported the technology efforts.
My time has expired, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, it has, but if you would like to ask an economist, Dr. Montgomery, those economic questions you ask into the other witnesses, I'll be glad to give you a few more minutes, Dr. Montgomery, to answer.
Which ones particularly do you want me to?
Well, you ask an economist whether they were, Dr. Montgomery is an economist, and if you want to ask him the question about the investment.
Certainly.
Glad to give you
Dr. Montgomery, well, do you agree that government support, subsidies, whatever, distorts the marketplace, the decisions that we made in the marketplace otherwise?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And in particular, I think that well, first, yes. And that there's a difference between distorting the marketplace and intervening in order to deal with true externalities like environmental protection. And I was trying to make that distinction in my testimony and rapidly in my 5 minutes, that it is a perfectly legitimate role and something which we have done quite successfully in many areas to establish cost-effective regulations that deal directly with emissions, like the Title IV sulfur program under the Clean Air Act. That's the right way to direct technology into cleaner energy because it deals with the emissions. Where the distortions come in is when the government picks the technologies by funding the technologies directly rather than concentrating on what the consequences of the technologies are and letting nuclear, renewable energy, natural gas, and others fight it out on a level playing field to see which one is the best way of meeting the environmental goals.
Okay. How about the Ultra Deep Water and Unconventional Natural Gas and Other Petroleum Research Fund? Does that fall within that? That doesn't seem anything to do with the environment. It seems to be simply with doing the research to how to drill down to 2 miles.
I think the other part of my testimony was that there is a general market failure in R&D, which leads to a lack of adequate investment across the board in the economy, including in the energy sector, in the basic and applied research that provides new ideas on which innovations are built. Now, I don't know whether that particular fund is doing that kind of basic and applied research or is doing something that the oil industry could have done perfectly well all by itself without having that money put into it. But I would call that, I would call that spending on technology development that may or may not be justified, depending on whether it's at the basic research end of the scale where government has an appropriate role.
The gentleman's time's expired. Just in fairness, the gentle lady,
Just for the record, I was prepared to keep going, Mr. Chairman.
What's that? I know. Ms. Lofgren, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. I come from Silicon Valley, where the tech sector is very excited about clean energy. I mean, it's not just the government programs that have given a tiny leg up to the industry, but also the venture capital world. That's the biggest area of new growth, and people believe in business and also in the academic world that this has a tremendous future, not only in energy production, but clearly in terms of job creation, and it's the next big thing that we don't want to miss out on. And as I review the testimony today, I do have a concern. There seems to be a questioning of government investment in clean energy and green jobs. Now, Mr. Miller mentioned the disparity in terms of research dollars, which the Congressional Research Service has advised us of, with most of the money going into nuclear and most of the rest going into fossil, and really just a small percentage going into clean energy. But I think that's just part of the story. We have, and I've heard no willingness on the other side of the aisle to take a look at the tax breaks that we are giving in the fossil fuel arena, especially to oil companies. Dr. Bivens, it seems to me if you add in the disparity in research funding with the tax breaks given to oil companies that nobody apparently is talking about repealing, what does this do to kind of a level playing field for the clean energy industry? Doesn't it make sense when we're subsidizing the oil industry and when we're disproportionately funding nuclear and fossil fuels to at least provide some assistance to this fledgling part of the energy economy, the high-tech sector?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm not an expert on exactly how much in the way of benefits that the fossil fuel industry gets, but I think your point is a good one. And I would add, but besides the direct benefits, subsidies, tax breaks going to the fossil fuel sector, I think the single biggest subsidy is our failure to price emissions that are harmful to other economic stakeholders. That's a huge subsidy. And so I think until we correct that one, we're just not giving the private sector near enough incentive to do the green investment on its own. So I think public sector incentives to give that give those incentives are a very good way to go.
Well, I was interested in Dr. Montgomery's comment in the exchange with Mr. Miller about the value of regulation to set standards that then people or industries will work to. I'm wondering, the governor of California just upped the renewable energy portfolio requirement to a third today. And what I hear from industry is that if they know what it is they're supposed to do, they can do it. What they need is some standards and what are the rules. And would you think that would help, what California is doing? Our energy consumption has remained flat while the population has grown about 25–30%.
I've done a lot of work on California's AB 32 implementation, so I will resist the temptation to talk about all of it.
Thank you.
I think the clean energy standard is a good example of a program which actually increases the cost of achieving the actual environmental objectives. And this is something we discussed at great length with the Air Resources Board and with the Economic and Allocation Advisory Committee. Larry Goulder chairs it from Stanford. That a cap-and-trade program in California would have been sufficient to achieve the goals of AB 32. Adding the clean energy standard to it serves only to limit the choices that utilities have for what kind of energy they are going to use to meet that standard, and it forces utilities to bear more of the burden.
It's interesting, if I can, I have limited time, I don't want to be abrupt or rude, but the utilities certainly don't feel that way. In fact, PG&E, which is the major utility and is the utility in my part of the state, pulled out of the Chamber of Commerce when they didn't support the cap and trade bill that the Congress had. Dr. Bivens, do you share that point of view? I mean, not that California is so perfect, we have our challenges, but from an energy point of view, we're making tremendous progress.
That general point of view that California has been a real leader in keeping energy consumption down relative to the rest of the country, absolutely. And I will say, you know, I bet I could construct a absolutely platonic perfect energy policy that follows textbook economics and gets us to exactly where we need to go. You know, that's not the world we live in. I mean, right now we've just got the market failing every day to put a price on emissions that harm other economic stakeholders, and so we should find a second best way to do the job until we get the platonic ideal.
Well, I think that's correct, and certainly the state of California has set the standard in many ways by setting fuel efficiency standards when the nation would not, and because it's such a large market, it actually did move fuel efficiency in the nation. And we're doing the same thing with air quality, energy consumption, renewable uses, and the like. I want to just switch briefly, because I'm almost out of time, to the role of basic science research, which there's no way industry has the funds to do that kind of pre-competitive, pre-commercial research. And I have a very deep concern that if we don't do adequate investments in basic research, university-based or in the national labs, that we're going to have a big problem in the future. And specifically, some of the reductions that are being proposed, for example, the Stanford Linear Accelerator, which is doing X-ray photography in a way where they will actually be able to see at a molecular level photosynthesis, which has tremendous potential in terms of energy. What is your take on the budget discussions on basic research, Dr. Bivens? And what would those cuts do for our future and competitively from a jobs point of view and from an energy point of view?
Yeah, I pretty much totally agree with you. I think cutting investments in basic research in a rush to budget austerity is kind of the definition of penny wise, pound foolish. I just don't think we should do it.
Dr. Montgomery, do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In fact, that was what I put into my opening statement to try to emphasize it more than my written testimony did. Absolutely, that I think the highest, that as you look at cutting the budget, it is very important that you protect the level of funding that we're now putting into basic energy research, not let it get cut. The problem is that it's generally been starved by Congress in order to continue funding the subsidies and deployment of existing technologies. And that's because of the jobs that creates. I think we have to
Well, there's jobs in basic science research too. Just talk.
Oh, there are, and that's just fine. Yeah. But don't lose sight. But don't concentrate so much on jobs that you put money into things instead of basic science.
I think we're the richest country in the world. We can do both, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now the chairman recognizes Mr. Holcomb for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple questions, and I'm sorry there's a couple different committee meetings at the same time, and wish I could have been here for the whole time, but we'll spend more time going over your testimony and things. But did want just some clarification if I could, and I guess I'll, Dr. Montgomery, if I can address this to you at first. Administration has made a high-profile effort to invest a significant amount of taxpayer money on green jobs. How should Congress evaluate various job creation proposals? Any suggestions that you'd have for us? Come closer to the microphone if you would.
It's the talk button that I keep forgetting. I would say ignore everything anybody says about jobs. You should be evaluating programs on their merits in terms of what do they cost, how do they address a specific externality or public policy problem, are they going to be increasing or reducing the cost of energy? The jobs calculation, I think, is the jobs argument is pure smokescreen. Everybody can argue that they are going to be creating jobs if you give them money, or losing jobs if you don't give them money. You have to actually look at the merits of what the money is doing.
Yeah. Mr. Kovacs, would you agree with that? I guess just kind of follow-up question. What's the appropriate cost that we should expect to pay? You know, is it $100,000 per job, or $1 million per job, or $10 million per job? Where do we start making a decision that this is too much? It's not being effective.
Our research doesn't confirm or deny any of that, but what it does state factually was that at least in March of 2010, there were 351 developers around the United States who were willing to put in $570 billion in direct investment that would have created roughly about $1.1 trillion as you have the multiplier effects, with about 1.9 million jobs. And what we're trying to say is the thing that held up that investment was the fact that the permits were challenged and challenged and challenged. And if the goal isn't necessarily an environmental goal, because every kind of facility was challenged, and 40% of the facilities that were challenged were all renewables. And there are 24 nuclear and I forget how many transmission, which would actually take the renewable power from the plains into Minnesota or Chicago. So you have a pot of money, and you have developers who are willing to risk their money to build these facilities. So the easier way to do it is to let the private sector do it, and the market will begin to sort itself out. Some will get permits, some won't. But even if you took just one facility per state, you still get to about $400 billion in direct investment. That's needed at this time.
Thanks, Mr. Kovacs. And I agree. It frustrates me when I see sometimes we're picking winners and losers, or we're pushing an agenda that the market just doesn't want. And, you know, there's some issues there, I think, so I appreciate your input there. Dr. Green, if I can ask you, are there other federal efforts that could be more efficiently, that they could just work more efficiently to help unemployed Americans and also stimulate the growth of the green economy? Are there things that you see that we could be focusing on that you'd recommend?
I lack the hubris to make suggestions like that. That would be better asked of someone who's more focused on sort of how economic stimulus works. I can recommend any of our economists at AEI for that.
Great. Well, I'll move right next door to you, if I could, with that question,
Yeah.
Dr. Kreutzer. If you have any suggestions, are there things, federal efforts that could be more efficiently used to help people who are unemployed, other than some of these green jobs initiatives?
Yeah, well, let's look at some of the things. First of all, we could have a separate discussion about the general benefit of federal funding of research. But the stimulus package doesn't fit that. We're trying to promote the economy. In the stimulus package, they had a carve-out of $140 million for climate data modeling. I checked with climatologists. I didn't know any unemployed climate data modelers. We had a $5 billion program for weatherization. State auditor in New Jersey, Stephen Ells, looked at the money that was being spent in New Jersey. 5% of the funding was spent documented on nothing. Close to 10%, they couldn't even tell where it had been spent. 8% was overspent. They spent $22 on a light bulb that cost $1.50. In short, out of $5 billion, if you use that ratio, $1 billion is wasted. So you could do a lot better stimulus for the economy by not wasting billions of dollars, by not ramping up money for people that are already employed. When it comes to the impact, there was a debate earlier on whether we had the studies that Dr. Green cited were peer-reviewed, as though they didn't matter if they weren't. But here's a statement from the Congressional Budget Office, last year on the impact of policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on employment. This is a quote. In particular, job losses in the industries that shrink with lower employment more than job gains in other industries would increase employment, thereby raising the overall unemployment rate. So it's not fossil fuel-funded researchers that are coming up with this. This is very general, consistent from economists. We had a panel at the Heritage Foundation in September of 2009. We had economists from the EIA. We had economists from the EPA. We had economists from the Congressional Budget Office. We had economists from the Brookings Institution. All of them analyzing the employment and the stimulative impact of Waxman-Markey. None of them found that it stimulated the economy. The debate was entirely over how much did it cost. Nobody found economic growth from that. And the question is it worth it? That's a reasonable debate to have. But you can't pretend that it's free.
I'm out of time. Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank the witnesses for y'all's valuable testimony here today. It's been very enlightening, and I thank the members for your questions. The members of the subcommittee have additional questions for the witnesses, and I'll ask all of y'all to respond to those questions in writing. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. And if you would, please get those answers in writing back to us within that 2-week period. The witnesses are excused. And
I just have a question. I'd ask unanimous consent that we be allowed to include materials for the record that were shared with the majority staff prior to the hearing.
You good?
Yeah.
You good? Okay. I think that's been agreed to, so ordered.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Witnesses excused. The hearing is now adjourned, and thank you all very much.